What matters is, do you think it's bad enough that someone should go to jail for it?
Can I point out a real quick irony that Bill Clinton passed the Defense of Marriage Act?
We're making decisions about people's lives when the 300 people in my church service couldn't even decide how to interpret these things.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Social Discord, Episode 9, Queer as History, Part 3, Modern Trials and Tribulations and History After Stonewall. I'm your host for today's episode, Dalen Turk.
I'm Kara Tebow.
And I'm Curtis Medina.
So today we're going to be talking about the years after Stonewall, the landmark cases that led to the equality the queer community enjoys today, and the challenges they still face in places like the workplace and the church. So to start with that, we're going to go into a Supreme Court case which actually took place before Stonewall, but it's good to point out because it was the only one that took part or that happened before Stonewall, and that is One Inc. versus Olesen in 1958. Curtis, could you go into that?
Yeah, it's really important because it was actually the first time that the Supreme Court really acknowledged at all a rights for queer people. And they didn't necessarily do it because they were necessarily forward thinking. They did it on the basis of, constitutionality. They basically, the court case was One Inc. was the first openly gay periodical that was being mailed to people. I think it was on some newsstands. And within like 2 months, it got ripped off the shelves because it was supposedly by those day standards obscene and perverse. And so the case basically said that it wasn't perverse or obscene just because it was gay. And that was a huge deal for the time because it basically upheld the rights of citizens over this idea of being gay being wrong.
Do we know, just for comparison, do any of you know when like Playboy magazine started? Because I'm just curious.
That's a good question.
I would guess somewhere in the post World War II. I don't know that. I think you're looking it up now, but yeah, I mean, if I were to make like a wild guess, it would probably be something like 1959 or something, 1955, somewhere in that like mid 50s range.
Ooh, Kara, any guesses?
Ooh, I'm going to say 1961.
Oh, you are both off. It was December 1953. And so I'd be
over.
I bring that up actually because we just watched I'm all about drunk history. And I'm really upset because they canceled it. I'm catching up on the show, so I'm not going to have any more to watch. But they just did an episode, or they did an episode a while ago. I just watched it, and it was on basically this journalist that was hired on as a bunny, and she infiltrated the Playboy mansion and blah blah. But it just made me curious. And actually, it looks like 1953 was the same year of the One Inc. magazine, and so I wonder what if there was a contrast of they allowed Playboy, which obviously they did, but they didn't allow a quote unquote homosexual magazine.
Well, I think it was that sex wasn't the issue, right? But it just had to be pleasing to the majority of people. And if you didn't like that, then it was not okay. And that we had to have Supreme Court cases over that.
Well, I'm not sure about it, but I haven't read one magazine ever, but I don't think, based on the reading I did, that it was really even like comparable to Playboy. I think it was more informational,
Right,
I don't know. I think it was necessarily like erotic or anything like that. So, I mean, it was a really weird, like, magazine to pick on, of all the things that you would pick on. It was just weird.
Well, also though, it's a magazine. If you don't like what's in it, then don't read it. Like, you have to physically pick it up yourself and read it in order for it to bother you. Which I guess maybe they just see it on the, magazine stands and it irritates them,
they got it out of the mail. They stopped it from being mailed privately to people. I mean, that's what we were talking about, in the previous episodes. The USPS was on like this mad mission to just prevent it from happening at all because it was perceived to be this thing that was going to, ruin America or whatever.
Could you imagine people like ripping through mailboxes in America to take away all of People magazine? That just sounds so absurd.
Constitutional, so it should sound absurd. Oh my god!
By the way, I forgot to mention our source for our major source for these court cases, but it's from a Time. I guess it's Time, still a magazine, but it's from Time, and it's 9 landmark Supreme Court cases that shaped LGBTQ rights in America. It was written by Tara Law, and it's a pretty great article. And so that's where the majority of our information for these court cases came from.
And then you got to jump ahead for the next big court case, to 1972.
Right.
What is that, 15, something like that, 14 years later, until you get the next sort of ruling. And by this time, like, America was quite different than it was in 1958. You already went past the civil rights era, or at least you were at the end of it. I think, Vietnam was really unpopular already, I believe, by that time. And so, it was ripe for change.
At this point, you're also behind the catalyst of the gay rights movement, Stonewall. So now it's right up front within American politics.
Yeah. So the next one is Baker versus Nelson, 1972. The Supreme Court considered the issue of marriage equality for the first time. So,
that's an interesting jump going from, can we have our own magazine? And then, 14 years later, it's like, oh, hey, can we be married?
Yeah, I guess basically nobody had really questioned it that much before that. And then when people started questioning it, they felt they needed to rule, and they actually dismissed the case for want of a substantial federal question, which is super sad.
I have no idea what that means.
It means that the court doesn't think that it's imperative for them to make a ruling, and they do that. Like even though you hear a lot about like the court ruled this, the court ruled that, the vast majority of cases that go before the court end with them saying that phrase, basically, come back later with more need.
So yeah, basically it's not important for us to rule on right now.
Yeah.
Which I guess at the time, like within society, maybe like that they saw that justifiable because I guess maybe people weren't out as much.
Yeah, and to be fair, it probably would have failed. It probably would have done nothing but make it worse if they had ruled on it. So, so it's probably better that they just said, maybe later kind of a thing. After that, Bowers versus Hardwick, 1986. Quote, the LGBTQ rights movement was dealt a major blow when the court decided to uphold Georgia sodomy law in 1986. The sodomy laws in the different states varied quite a bit, but they were a major hurdle for people, particularly gay people, to get over because it was something very specific to gay life that could land you in prison. And even though in the U.S. we didn't usually jail people just for being gay, you could jail somebody for sodomy laws, and that was mostly men with men, although there are a lot of cases as well of just say a straight couple getting caught doing that or something like that.
It's the idea of the U.S. government or any government being involved in the sexual encounters of two consenting adults is so creepy and Big Brother and like 1980 it literally was 1980, but it's creepy. When we look back at it now, we're like, what were they thinking?
Yeah. And we have to do a special asterisk with this one because this is the only time the Supreme Court ruled on anything during the AIDS epidemic. And I put together a lot of the notes for these episodes. And one of the things I actually really tried to avoid was the AIDS epidemic, just because it's so well covered and everything else that I feel like there's a million movies you can watch about it. But to put it in context with this case, basically under the feeling that gay people were deserving of death because they were doing something anti-moral, a lot of conservative people thought that basically AIDS was God's way of like striking them down or something like that. Really gross way of looking at it. And so even though maybe the Supreme Court didn't necessarily feel that way, it definitely changed their view of gay people, as it did for a lot of people in the country. And it was a real setback for gay people, because they were kind of full steam ahead, and then this happened, and they were dealing with mass death happening all around them. An entire generation of people, died, and so many of them were gay, but not all of them were gay, but so many of them were gay. In the quote here, the person in the Time article, really drove home a sadness that was felt right then, because they said, Karen Lowy, senior counsel, which fights for LGBTQ legal rights, told the Times that the court made a special effort to make clear that the case applied to LGBTQ people, despite the fact that the law didn't refer to genders of people involved. Mm-hmm. Quote, the court went out of its way to make clear that gay people could be criminalized under these provisions, and that there was nothing wrong with that. The court actually turned it into an inquiry about same-sex intimacy, where the statute wasn't even that specific. And it really labeled LGBTQ people as criminals in every sense. Employers would fire people and say, well, it has nothing to do with who you are. It has to do with the fact that you're a criminal. And so it was a law that didn't even necessarily need to include gay people, but they actually went out of their way to make the point that it should. And that was terrible for that whole movement.
Well, and the Supreme Court's justification for their opinion, was literally that, well, if states have laws about this, then it's criminal, it's criminalized sodomy. And so who are we to say that laws can't do that, basically? And they, like you said, they made it very clear that it wasn't about the sexual act itself. It was about the fact that it was a man and a man.
Yeah, it was really meant to be a roadblock. It was meant to be, you're getting too much, power to be who you are, and we don't like that. We're going to put a big roadblock up for you to make it even more difficult.
And by the way, just real quick, that quote you're saying, that was from Karen Lowy, senior counsel at Lambda Legal, which fights for LGBTQ legal rights.
Yeah, and then after that, you have to go all the way to 2003 before it really comes up again. So 86 to 2003, the next major court case. This was Lawrence versus Texas. Quote, the court ultimately eliminated sodomy laws in 2003. So just imagine that. Those were actually on the books in your parents' lifetime or in your lifetime. That was on the books in a lot of states, and it was not overturned until 2003, but it was overturned by a vast majority with a vote of 6-3. Justice Kennedy delivered the opinion saying that the due process clause of the 14th Amendment gave the petitioners, quote, the full right to engage in private conduct without government intervention. The Texas statute furthers no legitimate state interest which can justify its intrusion into the individual's personal and private life. I mean, and bless that. That's great.
Yep.
I mean, basically,
all kinds of things.
Basically, it's saying the government has no right to say what a human can or cannot do in their bed.
Well, yeah, if you have two consenting adults, the government doesn't get to then tell you what to do, because that's creepy.
Yeah,
that's creepy. I want to point out too, and Curtis, you said when you went into Lawrence v. Texas, it's 2003. This case was decided, and these crazy sodomy laws that barely anyone could believe are real was alive in 2003, and we talking about all these weird old laws like, oh, you can't ride your horse to a bar, or you can't catch a fish on Sunday and then cook it, whatever, all these weird, crazy laws. And I think, for this instance, we joke about all these weird laws that mean nothing, but it kind of goes to show why our justice system and why our laws really need to be looked at and updated, because up until 2003, people could be prosecuted for, sodomy. And granted, it was definitely targeted to, people of the LGBTQ community, but the fact that there were laws against this in 2003 is just wild. And so we desperately need to look at the justice system. And we just
even that word choice, like calling it sodomy, was like very intentional. That's a very like derogative word for something, and it's like a perversion.
It's biblical.
We just call it biblical sex when people, like, two adults get to do that. And so that was very intentional. And crazy. 2003, not that long ago.
Yeah, and and the next law actually talks about something that I think we should probably fill in for a lot of people who weren't alive at the time or didn't know about it. The whole don't ask, don't tell thing that was signed into law during Bill Clinton's time, and this law, DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act, which was also signed into law by Bill Clinton. So like a lot of time, so a lot of, let's say, Democrats, in 2016, when they were pushing Hillary Clinton as the go-to person, and they just didn't understand why people couldn't get super excited about Hillary Clinton, it was because they had a lot of baggage. And one of the things that they had was DOMA. And, that was something that was signed by her husband that, at the time Hillary Clinton supported.
Can I point out a real quick irony that Bill Clinton passed the Defense of Marriage Act, and he's the most, like, his presidency is the most well-known sex scandal in American political history, and he passed the Defense of Marriage Act.
I mean, if anyone would know, I guess it'd be him.
That's fair.
I don't know. I mean, it would be like Trump passing the Anti-Casino Act or something. I don't know.
Right.
I do want to point something out really quickly as well. This is not a sweeping generalization blanket of all of Europe, but for a lot of like places in Western Europe and other countries as well, they find places like America, where we consider ourselves like so liberated and progressive. They find it very, very weird how involved we are, like with our politician sex life or with our citizen sex life. It's very strange to other people looking in. And so it's definitely a weird American culture around like sex and politics that not necessarily every developed country follows. It's an interesting American issue.
Here we
go.
Might
be one good thing about Trump too, the fact that Republicans have no problem with Trump's divorces and womanizing and the thing he says and all that, like, maybe that time in America of criticizing people who don't have perfect marriages or whatever, maybe it's over. I don't know. Maybe that's the one good part of the Trump presidency.
Yeah, fair enough.
Here's another Aaron Sorkin plug for The West Wing. I'm just about done with it. I have like 2 episodes left.
It's been off for 25 years, Dalen. They're not going to sponsor us.
I can keep trying. But there's a scene at the end of the show, spoilers, where Matt Santos, he's running for president, and footage gets leaked of his hotel room where he and his wife are having sex, and they, subsequently break the bed. And they're like, why does this matter? Why is anyone? And everyone's like, this is the big story. Like, of course people are going to watch this and pay attention to this and talk about this. It's American politics. Half of it is gossip.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and I mean, even though I was a kid, when it happened with Bill Clinton, I mean, I didn't care. I remember thinking like, what does this have to do with anything? Like, I mean, it's like, I'm not really for it, but at the same time, like, just run the country. Well, I don't care.
So French, Curtis. That's such a French mentality.
So coming up next, United States versus Windsor. That's 2013. So we're getting into very modern times. Quote, this case was one of the major precursors to marriage equality. The court decided to eliminate the portion of the Defense of Marriage Act, which was the one signed by Bill Clinton of 1996, that defined marriage as a legal union between one man and one woman as husband and wife. The case considered the situation of Edith Windsor and Thea Spire, who were married in Canada before moving to New York, a state that recognized their marriage. After Spire passed away, Windsor's attempts to claim tax exemption for surviving spouses were blocked by DOMA, and so they sued the government. Good for them. In a 5-4 vote, so a 1 vote difference, which is super important. Going into 2020, if vote for nothing else, but to make sure that the next time the Supreme Court is chosen, which is probably going to be soon with Ruth Bader Ginsburg getting up there in years, that 1 vote difference makes all the difference in the world. And you're going to find that over and over again with things like gay marriage and stuff like that. But yeah, in a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court ruled that DOMA violated due process and equal protection principles and ordered the United States to refund Windsor's taxes.
Yeah,
Quote,
the IRS billed her $363,000.
Wow.
Yeah, how wild is that?
And I mean, insult to injury too. You're already a grieving spouse. You know, I mean, if anyone has enough anger to sue the government and follow it all the way through, it's somebody like that who's already went through hell. You know, and you're just rubbing it in, you know, trying to make their marriage seem less than, you know, than equal to somebody else.
One of the Supreme Court justices basically said, you know, on like the law does not necessarily protect, you know, marriage laws do not protect love. They protect Social Security. They protect, you know,
Sure.
taxes. They protect all this stuff. So they're like, yeah, people can be lovey-dovey, but that's not what these laws are protecting. And and so that's how they used to justify, well, it should be between a man and a woman. It's not about love. And it's a whole thing, and we'll get into it here in a bit.
Sure. No, you're totally right.
But this is a great example of that.
That's what I argued when all this was going on with people was, you know, like, even if you're totally anti, you know, LGBT, like, it doesn't matter. And, you know, like they should be protected equally, you know,
Right.
And all the boring things, all the, you know, things like, like being able to, you know, see your partner in the hospital, you know, it's like, like how spiteful do you have to be in your beliefs to block somebody from that just because they're the same sex? I mean, it's just, I don't know. It's another level of cold.
I know. I really like people who don't believe in, you know, gay marriage. I really want to ask them, like, people who really do not think a man should not marry a man, a woman should not marry a woman. Like, what if there was a law that said, you know, you cannot marry your significant other? Like, how would you feel? And they, of course, they'll say, well, you know, whatever their justification, probably using, I would assume something from the Bible. But I just can't imagine someone would react and be like, well, if that's the law, you know.
Yeah,
I think it's hard to argue with religion too, because if you believe that your belief is the difference between going to heaven and going to hell, it's so difficult to change somebody's opinion on that. And so I'm glad we're going to talk about it a little bit later in the podcast too.
I always say it doesn't matter if you agree with whatever law it is. What matters is, do you think it's bad enough that someone should go to jail for it?
Yep.
Like,
and
you know,
believe that we should have freedom in this country.
Yeah.
People have the right to do what they want to do. And I believe that answer is yes.
Yeah. I mean, like, you know, marijuana legalization, say you think it's the devil, you think it's terrible, but does that mean that you want, you know, your son or daughter going to jail for it? It doesn't make any sense. And most things don't. I mean, most laws like these, when you really get down to it, the punishment is so much worse than whatever crime is supposedly taking place. Then you got to jump forward to 2015.
Here we go, Curtis.
Obergerfell versus Hodges.
Your time to
I hope
shine.
I said that right.
It's Obergefell. Obergerfell.
That sounds better. Yeah. And you got to be really careful because, I mean, this is so recent. You know, these people are still alive. I mean, you know, they like. I was just reading a paper of like an event that happened a few years ago, and they actually invited them to this Pride event, you know, to like just to meet them or whatever. So I mean, they're alive and they're still touring, and you know, so yeah, they might actually listen to this.
And ultimately, the reason this case one is so important and we want to get right is because it led to the biggest victory within the movement, which was marriage. Yeah, and it was such an important thing because I think the queer people, I think they needed the legitimacy of the law. You know, they knew that they were in love with these people. A lot of them had been in relationships, monogamous relationships for, you know, 30, 40, 50 years already. You know, I mean, they weren't going to change. Nothing, you know, I mean, that was who they were with, but having it officially recognized was a big deal.
And so again, 5-4 vote. Again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg not there, might not have happened. We might still be living in a country that, didn't allow gay people to marry,
RBG,
lesbians to marry. Yeah. So again, vote because the president is the person that assigns the Supreme Court justices.
Have you guys seen that thing going around? It's like, if you don't like Trump and you don't like Biden, remember that you're voting for who the next Supreme Court justice is, because most likely that's what's going to happen. It's
that's
the number one thing.
Didn't Donald Trump just put out his list of 20 options, and I think Ted Cruz is one of them?
If the Zodiac Killer becomes the next Supreme Court justice, I will lose my mind.
Kara, we are not about to spread that conspiracy.
It was a joke.
This is now a conspiracy podcast. Anyways.
Oh my god.
But yes,
I don't know.
The Supreme Court is very important.
Yeah. It is.
But it's actually, it was in this case actually where, so Justice Kennedy said it is demeaning to lock same-sex couples out of a central institution of the nation's society, for they too may aspire to the transcendent purposes of marriage. To which Merrill, who I guess was Supreme Court Justice at the time, or someone who's involved in this case.
Sounds right, but I'm actually not sure.
It doesn't clarify. It just says Merrill. But it says Merrill argues that while she personally values the emotional aspect of matrimony, getting married in the United States is considered to be a legal status. She says, or he or she, I'm not sure. At the end of the day, it's a social security benefits, it's survivor benefits, it's healthcare, it's super unromantic. So basically, marriage, it's matrimony, it's only matrimony, it's lovey-dovey, but in the end it's a legal status recognized by the country, and it should it shouldn't take love into consideration for law.
My favorite part about this was, people fought since the beginning of, the queer movement for marriage equality, but just de facto along with the passing of gay marriage was gay divorce. There was a joke that a comedian said let them get married, we won't let them get divorced, and but I loved how nobody argued about gay divorce.
With one comes the other.
Yeah. But yeah, really close opinion, but it did pass, and it struck down every state's laws that were preventing it, including one that was in California. It was Prop 8 or something like that. And it made it legal in every state at once, which was crazy because some states were more ready than others. Some states had fought more than others. But it never would have happened in a lot of states like South Carolina, for example, probably Texas, that, unless it was made a federal law. And that was really important. And then in 2020, this year, the court determined that firing an employee for being gay, lesbian, or transgender was actually a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act from 1964, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex. And what's really important about that is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her claim to fame before becoming a Supreme Court justice was that she actually changed the law back when she was a lawyer, where basically making the Supreme Court admit that you could not discriminate on the basis of sex. And so it was really interesting that her career is going to be capped off by a law that used that same argument and extended it from civil rights to gender to sexuality. And it's just a perfect kind of end to that career.
When I was reading through these notes and I got to the end of the court cases, this one saying that you can't be fired from your job, I immediately pulled up Google and started typing madly because I was like, there's no way this didn't happen until 2020. I 100% thought this was already put into place. And
nope.
it's I can't believe that it wasn't.
But we talked about this in more episodes as well, but this is so important, and it was such a landmark case, but there is still a lot of work to be done on the loopholes that allow, especially in states like Texas, a right to work state, employers the ability to fire someone for any reason, because they can fire you under whatever they want. But it could be because they're discriminating. So such a great start, a lot more loopholes to close, but this is, I feel like we're slowly getting there. We're getting there.
To me, this always matters more with the companies that are bigger. Like, I mean, I think it matters, but at the same time,
right.
like, I do understand somebody is uncomfortable with it or something. I mean, I don't know. I probably shouldn't say that, but I do understand if somebody's uncomfortable with it, they might not want to say hire to begin with a queer person, or isn't comfortable with, for whatever reason, them being around them or whatever. And I don't like the idea of forcing people to be progressive. Like, I always just want people just to be good people and not force them to do it.
But hopefully, if you're hiring on the basis of like work ethic and like someone's like capability, then I don't know.
Shouldn't matter.
I would hope so, but I hear what you're saying. Like, but because also, like, as an employee, I don't want to be in an uncomfortable workspace if someone doesn't believe with my quote unquote lifestyle, aka who I am and who I choose to love. So
right.
Yeah, I can see how that would be tricky.
It's important though on the bigger companies, because like I think Dalen mentioned in another episode that like the company that you guys were either working for in the past, I can't remember which company it was, but sent out like a letter or whatever saying that they intended to be very like fair about hiring gay and lesbian people or queer people, and that makes such a big difference with those kind of companies, because it puts it on the radar for them that maybe they weren't even intentionally trying to be exclusivatory or whatever, but that they now see that it's important, and even in the law that they should try to include a wider variety of people.
And ultimately, this idea of within the workplace feeling uncomfortable plays into other aspects, and we'll go into it later, of how the company, how employees treat customers, and we'll go into it in a bit, like the cake debate. The cake decorator who decided that he wasn't going to make a wedding cake for a gay couple.
Right.
And it's we're going into this episode of talking about the struggles that queer people still go through, and a big place that they go through those struggles is the workplace. But one thing I wanted to say too.
Do you want to talk about it? I mean, we can talk about it now, even though it's later in the notes. I think you're right. I think it actually might.
Sure, we can go into it. I just wanted to say one thing first. In the 2015 case of Obergerfell and Hodges, I remember seeing when the case was decided and it was won, and I saw it on the news, and at the time I still hadn't, like, I was still really honestly quite ignorant of queer issues and just queer peoples, and like I was progressive and whatnot, but I just had a lot to learn at the time still. But I remember seeing on the news they had one of the main people fighting within the 14 queer couples, and he he lost his job, and maybe I'm thinking something different, but anyways, he spent like 6 years of his life. He lost like all of his money, lost his house, all this stuff, and by the end, just for this one thing. And I, at the time, I couldn't imagine like something so like important that you would basically throw away your life to win this case. And I'm like, it's literally like your rights as a human being that you're fighting for. And at the time, like, I guess I didn't really grasp that. And then I saw that news interview and it hit me. I was like, oh wow, like this is life. It was pretty interesting to see the impact, like, from somebody, not just like, oh hey, this is a court case and they won it. It was like seeing like their faces. It was pretty impactful to watch.
Yeah, and guess what? Straight marriage did not implode. I mean, we did not. The country did not burn down.
Like
after
society's values did not go backwards.
Nope. We just allowed more people to love each other. It was crazy how long it even took. I mean, it always takes, 5 times as long as it should. All these things.
But yeah, why don't we go ahead and talk about the cake debate? Because it was another Supreme Court ruling. We just had it later on within the show. So Supreme Court ruled in 7-2 that a Colorado baker who refused to bake a cake for a gay couple celebrating their marriage based off of his religious objection. It went against his religious values. And the court decided in his favor, basically saying that that they couldn't put their, right to marriage over his right to practice his religion and go by his religious ideologies just because it went against theirs.
Right. I mean, it had a lot more to do with religious liberty than it did with gay marriage. But I know I brought this up in the past about the law that finally struck down segregation in private businesses, saying that it was unconstitutional, that the products that pass between states or whatever that go to the places that you say eat at a restaurant or something are they cross state lines, so it becomes a federal issue. Therefore, they can say that it's bad for the economy to say that this person can eat here, but this other person can't. And the sad thing with this law or with this ruling was if you claim your religious liberty entitles you to be prejudiced against somebody that you don't like, it's scary, because had they thought to use that argument in the 60s when they were trying to desegregate private businesses, we could still be living in an America where black people use this store, white people use this store, and I wish that the ruling had been a lot more limited and did not stand up quite as much for religious liberty to be prejudiced.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a very tricky topic and also a slippery slope, because on one end you are protecting people's religious liberty, but on the other end you're protecting other people from having somebody else's religious liberty thrust upon them. Like the choice is literally either someone gets a right to quote unquote, practice whatever they believe, but that means that they can then force that on other people. It can impact them. And that's really tough. That's not easy to argue, especially in a court of law where everything is, way more convoluted than that.
And basically what Justice Anthony Kennedy went on to say was that it was the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, and they showed animus towards Phillips, specifically him, when they were suggesting basically that he was using his religious freedom to justify his discrimination. And it's such a fine line, because it's like, okay, well, technically, yeah, like it's his, it's his religion, and his religion does not agree with gay marriage, but then also it's, discriminating based off of sex. It's just such a, and I wonder if they decided in favor of Phillips more so too, because maybe religion has been instilled within American society for longer, so therefore it's a stronger basis. I don't know.
Yeah, there's also this thing about like the separation of you and your personal beliefs and your business. Like it's one thing if it's in your house, or if it's part of your personal life, you should have the freedom to say, no, this isn't part of my religion, blah, blah, blah. But just because like you're religious and you own Hobby Lobby or something like that doesn't mean that Hobby Lobby is now a religious institution. It's not. You're a religious person that runs a business. It doesn't make the business itself religious.
Well, it's interesting too, because Phillips said, I think it was in a news article, and actually might be the same one. It's a CNN article. It is Supreme Court rules for Colorado baker in same-sex wedding cake case. It's written by Ariana DeVogue. But basically, Phillips said to them, he said, I'll bake you any other type of baked good. I'll bake you another cake. But he didn't want to bake a wedding cake because he didn't believe in the marriage of two men. And so it was literally the fact that it was a wedding cake that he had disagreed with. He would have made them a birthday cake.
Which, come on. Okay, fine. We're going to call it a birthday cake. We'll go ahead and put the groom topper on there. What?
I don't know. I mean, I definitely this is showing my moderate side. From the other perspective, I think as the gay people, it's like, I wouldn't want to be made a cake by somebody that had felt that strongly against me. So I probably would have just turned the other cheek and been like, okay, I will go anywhere else and they won't have a problem with this, but I know they kind of want to make a point out of it, which I think is why a lot of things get taken to Supreme Court. But I don't know, at the same time, I don't know. It's his business, you know.
Right.
I mean, literally his business, his place of business or whatever. You know, I don't like the idea of forcing people to do things that they don't want to do. But the reality is that everybody at work does things that they don't want to do, serves people that they really don't want to serve, you know, and not that many people cite, you know, God as a reason they don't have to serve you.
I guess that the thing too, from what I understand, is they it's not like this they were having to make something special. Like, they already made wedding cake, so it was it's a refusal to serve a good that you already do. I think it's a very different story for like, hey, can you customize and make me this? And but like, I know that you don't normally make it, but can you make it special for us? It's like, no, we don't. That's not what we do. We'll support that, I believe in it or whatever. But you already make wedding cake, so you were refusing to provide a service. But Curtis, I hear what you're saying, and I think that was a big argument too of people saying, well, then just go somewhere else. Why would you want to put up with that? And their point was, because it is a point we have to make. So that's such a good example that we're talking about, because it is so, I wish it was black and white, but it's not at all.
Oh no. What were your guys' thoughts when, this story broke out? And of course it was kind of the beginning of what today people call cancel culture. But what did y'all think when people all of a sudden started saying, boycott this bakery, like don't go to this bakery? Like, I personally don't think that was fair to Phillips, just because he was following his faith, he was following his ideologies. I don't think, I think it's fair to boycott
turn them into
him.
a martyr as well, even if you don't, agree with the business or whatever. If you do a boycott on the level of like, a GoFundMe kind of thing, like a national like thing, you definitely give them more power than they ought to have for that opinion. So I don't know. I mean, I always kind of laugh when I see in a comment like somebody like yelling in all caps "boycott," like no matter what, no matter which side or whatever I happen to be on and whatever issue it is, it's kind of a childish thing to just sort of yell over something like this.
Right.
I think you have to be much more selective. Like I have a family member that's a big Trump supporter, and it made me laugh because so recently. The NBA did the thing where they refused to play a game because the Black Lives Matter issue wasn't being fairly considered or whatever by a lot of the fans, or by a lot of say people in America, and my family member made me laugh because the next day he was typing on something I wrote like I'm not watching any sports now, except golf. Except golf, because of course Trump plays golf, but yeah, I mean, of all I don't know if I have it in the notes for today, but the Gillette thing with the toxic masculinity, and everyone was like boycott Gillette or whatever, yeah, you get to a point where you're boycotting everything,
Right.
You're gonna have to live like a monk or something, because everything is gonna be off limits because they had an opinion, so I don't know, you
my
do it
friend
if you feel important.
We literally had argued about this the other day. There's a certain restaurant chain that may or may not be in the news frequently for I don't actually know the facts the best on it, but for, not necessarily supporting the gay community and for giving money to resources that do the opposite. But we were arguing about something, and she was like, nobody can go there. And I was like, okay, no, I totally believe in voting with your dollars, but also then take off your Nike shorts, then take off this. Where does it is so hard to make ethical decisions these days. And I do worry that cancel culture is so quick to judge, but then also, then what are we supposed to do? And I think voting with your dollars is super important, but I think we need to take it to the top a little bit more. Cancel culture puts the onus on individual citizens who are making, hourly wages to enact social change on their own. But these decisions need to be aided from the top down. And we can't just pretend all these citizens, they're just not coming together to kumbaya. No, there's policies in place that are hindering our ability to move forward with social progress. So also let's focus it on the people who can actually make the change and not blame each other.
That's true. And I mean, and with corporations too, it really complicates things because, you might hear a story about let's say one chain was anti this or anti that, but it doesn't mean that everybody who owns that chain is against those things. And
I think
so you
Chick-Fil-A is a great example.
Yeah. I don't have all the facts in front of me, but I know that Chick-fil-A is sort of a complicated one.
So complicated.
Yeah. Like they definitely have like given, I think it was the CEO or something had given money to anti-gay.
It was a conversion camp in Africa.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
And I think, if I remember right, I think it was like part of I think they basically gave it to a church. And one of the things the church did was a conversion camp. And so like, the question becomes, did they do it because of that viewpoint? Did they do it without knowledge of that viewpoint?
Right.
Is that a good enough reason to just never eat there again? It is a little bit more complicated than simply something like the Ollie's case back in the 60s where they just didn't allow black people inside. Like that is much more like straightforward. It was one owner, one place, a stupid rule that nobody liked, or nobody progressive, I guess, liked. And that was an easier way to boycott. But yeah, when you're talking about like these corporations or whatever, really like it depends on how much they're putting that opinion out there and how much people are kind of digging in order to find those ways that they're supporting something they don't agree with. For me, like Hobby Lobby was a lot more of a better example because they actually, as a company, decided not to, or to sue the government over the right not to give their employees health care just in case they might use it for an abortion, which I don't think was even part of it. Yeah. So, as a company, they did that and they made a big stink about it. And I think they won, actually. I think they didn't have to allow Obamacare or whatever. And so, that was a lot more of a direct action versus, like I said, like, I think there was a story of like an individual franchisor or something that was like a big supporter of, Trump or something. And then there was like an anti-Trump movement about like, don't go to any more of this franchise. And, I remember pointing out like, that's one, he owns like 10 of these franchises and there's like 1,000 of them in the country. Like you're hurting more people than
that's a great point.
You're thinking of.
All right.
Anyway, but we gotta get back to.
So let's go ahead and move on. So let's look at some important figures of the first wave of fighters. So we're gonna start off with Christine Jorgensen, who is known as the first American transgender woman to actually have a sex reassignment surgery.
No, that's not right. To become widely known,
known. I apologize.
Yeah, she was not the first, but it was
the first American, correct?
I don't even think that's true. It was the important thing about her is that she became a celebrity for it, and it was whereas the other ones, it was sort of like it might have been in a scientific paper or something like that.
It was the first
like
American.
They splashed her all over the place.
So and so I'm reading this article. It's from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and it's from G.I. Joe to G.I. Jane, Christine Jorgensen's story, which is not. Okay, it's a questionable title. But it says became the first American transgender woman to attain fame for having a sex assignment surgery. But yeah, I mean it was very interesting because Christine Jorgensen served for the U.S. Army in World War II, and I think they kind of go into saying it that. She was at the time not ridiculed, at least to begin with, for her sex reassignment surgery because, it's a veteran and she had all these, traits that were valued within the American system. And so when, she ended up going to Europe for her surgery and came back, she really wasn't met with the ridicule that she was expecting to begin with.
Well, she was kind of idolized because she was like the perfect example of what you would want to be if you changed your sex.
Right.
And, I mean, like the other great, greater, I guess, entertaining headline was XGI becomes blonde beauty, like,
right.
Like, I mean, she was beautiful.
Long hair.
Caitlyn Jenner, probably.
Long blonde hair, long toned legs, like, yeah. And it's interesting too because she was idolized and really was met with pretty like good treatment when she came back, but then it was figured out that, and especially she kind of came under fire with feminist groups and some members of the LGBTQ community, and it's kind of the argument that J.K. Rowling had, where they figured out she had her male genitals taken away, but or removed, but she didn't have a vagina, and so all of a sudden it's like, oh, so it's not she is a transgender woman. It became he is a what's the word they used? So unfortunately, she did not receive surgical created vagina until years later when she was back in the United States before oh god, what is the word? But basically, they, rather than a transgender woman, they looked at her as a disfigured man, because she didn't have female genitalia yet.
Well, I mean, some people did, and it was a little bit of a kind of like a shock story, I guess, maybe like a little bit more legitimate than sort of a tabloid. But what was really significant about Jorgensen was that they added, in addition to the sex change, they added female hormones,
estrogen,
to it, which really helped form her into sort of the ideal female body, at least from afar, at least, and that was really like it was a big jump forward, because it showed sort of like how you could not just be somewhat in the middle, but also like go toward your goal of being more feminine on a biological level.
And she actually, didn't she go on to be a fairly successful actress?
Yeah. I don't have a list of the things she did, but yeah. And they had the Christine Jorgensen story that was in like I believe the 70s with a it wasn't Farrah Fawcett. It was Karen Black, something like that. Anyway, but it was even in the 70s and 80s, like it was being talked about as this sort of like on a more glamorous level, not the typical like depressed person like trying to be something they're not. Like it was more glamorous, like this is somebody becoming who they are, and it really was a huge jump forward.
Like a kind of, I mean, one of the first examples within fame within the public eye of this is, they're obviously much happier now than they were before.
Yeah, it was what they wanted, not something that they were doomed to or something. It really was a big jump.
Mm-hmm.
And then sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say Jerry DeGreek and Nancy Weschler.
Yeah, so something that really surprised me when I was researching this was how early the first openly gay and lesbian people that were elected to office were in. So in Ann Arbor, Michigan, what you said, DeGreek and Weschler, both were elected in 1972, and they came out while they were serving in the city council. Weschler was replaced on the city council by Kathy Kozachenko, but this was even more important, I think, who openly ran as a lesbian and won in 1974, becoming the first openly gay person to win office after first coming out. And that was huge. I mean, think about, we always think of like a lot of the first being, say San Francisco or something, and much later in the 70s, and then a lot more like lately. But this was 1974 and 1972 in Michigan.
Well, and DeGreek and Weschler only came out, I think it was 6 months before Kathy Kozachenko ran for council. And Kathy was also at the time only a student at UM, and I think it was her professor, who was like, hey, you should run, and you should run as openly lesbian. And she was like, okay. And then she won. I believe that was the only, she was in it, the council for, I think it was 2 years, and that was the only public office she ever held. But she was, this young progressive, and they were actually part of the, or all three of them, Kathy Kozachenko, Nancy Wishel, and Jerry DeGreek, were all part of the, I think it was the Human Rights Party, and which eventually kind of morphed and became part of the Socialist Party of Michigan.
Interesting.
But next on the list, we have Silvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, which we discussed quite a bit during our episode on Stonewall.
Yeah, and one of the things I was just hearing today in a video about trans people is that these two, Silvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, are a lot of times really kind of passed over, not included in sort of the original activists that were part of the Stonewall riots. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of, they feel like it's almost like an erasure of trans people from the Stonewall movement. So yeah, I really wanted to make sure they got mentioned.
Well, it's
Silvia
interesting
Rivera,
too, because Marsha P. Johnson is so often referenced as the one who threw the first brick.
Right. Yeah, and it apparently there may have not been any bricks, and years later, Marsha P. Johnson actually said that she arrived later, and after it already had started. So we're pretty sure that wasn't the case, but nobody knows exactly who was threw the first stone or whatever got thrown.
Who were Silvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, though, ultimately?
Yeah, so Silvia Rivera was a Latina American drag queen who became one of the most radical gay and transgender activists in the 1960s and 70s. As a co-founder of the Gay Liberation Front, Rivera was known for participating in the Stonewall riots of 1969 and establishing the political organization STAR, which stood for Street Transvestite, later changed to transgender, because transvestite is not the word to use anymore, Street Transgender Action Revolutionaries, with fellow friend and drag queen Marsha P. Johnson. Mm-hmm. Both took part in the Stonewall riots, but they've admitted later in their life they did not throw the first brick or the stone, as was initially reported.
Which brings us to probably the heaviest hitter or the most well-known, which is Harvey Milk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a great movie that came out called Milk by Gus Van Sant a few years ago. I actually happened to be I'm not in the movie, but I actually was there when they were filming it.
That's cool.
And they cut me out of it. But there was one part I was walking right next to Sean Penn, who plays Harvey Milk.
That's awesome.
That's awesome.
I'm convinced that they cut it out because I looked at the camera or something.
No,
I'm like convinced. Like,
you can't break the fourth wall.
Yeah, I think I might have. I hope I didn't ruin it for everyone. Anyway, but it was really cool though to be a part of that, because they recreated the entire Milk March, which happened after Harvey Milk's assassination, and so it was kind of a double thing with Harvey Milk. He challenged the city's gay leadership, which he thought was too conservative in its attempts to gain greater political rights for homosexuals. And in 1973, Milk ran for the seat of on the city's board of supervisors in San Francisco, but was defeated. But after another unsuccessful bid in 1976, he was elected in 1977, becoming one of the first openly gay elected officials in U.S. history. The following year, though, Milk and the city's mayor, George Moscone, were shot and killed in City Hall by Dan White, a conservative former city supervisor. At White's murder trial, his attorney successfully argued that his judgment had been impaired by a prolonged period of clinical depression, one symptom of which was the former health enthusiast's consumption of junk food. Now, this came to be known as the Twinkie defense.
The Twinkie defense.
Yeah, as just the lamest reason to supposedly be drawn to kill someone. But he also was very anti-gay, so it probably was a lot more to do with the fact that he was against that aspect. But yeah, Harvey Milk, very iconic person in the Pride movement.
And I want to point out too, so this is from Britannica, and turns out Milk had served in the Navy during the Korean War and it says, quote, other than honorably discharged in 1955 for having engaged in sexual acts with another enlisted men. So even he was, someone who struggled, who was affected by these sodomy laws, and within the military too, which is still something.
been thought of as a hero,
right?
Because of that, taken down.
If you get a chance to watch the movie, it's Sean Penn and
James Brolin.
James Brolin, yes.
Yeah.
And it is a fantastic movie. Have you, Curtis, ever been to because he worked as a financial analyst in New York for a bit after the military, and then when he moved to San Francisco, he opened the Camera Store, which kind of became the epicenter of the gay community, and ended up becoming his headquarters for his campaigns. But have you ever been to that Camera Store before?
Yeah, I'm sure I have. I actually don't remember. I actually don't remember like specifically what it was, but I do remember when they were making milk, they actually shut down the entire area of the Castro, and they did have a shop that they were at least making into the Camera Store. I don't know if it was like historically accurate, but I got to see basically what their version of it was as they recreated it, and right. Yeah, I mean I've spent a lot of time at the Castro and all that, so
gotcha.
I'm sure that I walked by it at least.
Fair. So the Twinkie defense ultimately did work in a sense that White's conviction was a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter, and it ended up actually sparking a huge uproar within the city, and that night is actually now known as White Night Riot. But yeah, just a very influential case that changed a lot of the attitude in the San Francisco area for gay people and queer people in that community.
It made them angry.
It absolutely did.
I mean, it's
junk food defense. I mean, rightfully so, they're angry.
Well, and ultimately, I know White, because he was being honestly outshone a lot by Milk, because Milk was just as incredibly persuasive, determined, and very charming human being, and White just really wasn't. And White wanted Milk to support him on a bill, and I honestly think he needed Milk to speak against, I think it was gay marriage or something of the nature, and Milk obviously was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And that was something that ultimately led to Dan White's spiral and ultimately his killing of the mayor and Milk, because the mayor was also in huge support of Milk.
Mm-hmm. And now there's a Moscone Center. There's I believe there's a statue of Harvey Milk. I'm kind of blanking on it right now, but so I mean they basically became martyrs for this movement because they were very out and proud and a big part of the Pride movement. It was absolutely the wrong way to handle it for somebody who disagreed with the gay movement, because it really empowered a lot of people to get into politics after that and did the exact opposite of what they were hoping for. So next up, let's talk about other prejudices that are still alive today that we're still fighting for. The Boy Scouts of America debate has been a big thing over the last 10 years. They actually had to they're under a lot of scrutiny. A lot of people left or stopped supporting the Boy Scouts after a while. Side note, the Girl Scouts have actually been very accepting of queer people for, I think it's been like since the 70s or something. I mean, it's,
all right, ladies.
Yeah, completely different attitude about it. But the Boy Scout debate was a public fallout that eventually made through pressure made them accept Scouts that wanted to be openly gay, whereas before that it was kind of the don't ask, don't tell sort of thing. At first, it only allowed the Scouts to be openly gay and not the adult leaders, which was interesting because I think there was some kind of lawsuit. I don't know if it went all the way to Supreme Court. I don't think it did, but there was some kind of lawsuit where one of the leaders was gay and wanted to be open about it, and even so he won it for the kids, but he himself could not be open about it. Even still, I believe that has changed. I think more recently, somewhere in the last few years, you can now be open as a Scout leader as well. But it's when there's some massive changes.
So if you were a scout, if you could be openly gay, if you were, a preteen or a teenager, but when you grew up, if you wanted to be a scout leader, you had to, okay.
Exactly.
That, right?
Yep. I mean, it comes back to this idea of people thinking that adults are somehow making the kids gay, or that somehow influencing it or whatever. And
also to suggest that you can be who you are and then to shove someone back in the metaphorical closet when they turn 18 or whatever we're talking about. That's insanely traumatic, I would imagine.
It's a good example of why sometimes compromise isn't an option.
Right.
Thank you. It is. Yes, it is.
Yeah. They thought that was the compromise, and sometimes that's just not enough, and people need to realize that.
Well, and there are some parts of so within the Boy Scouts, basically different I guess what are they called, troops? I don't. Different groups within the Boy Scouts are sponsored by organizations and whatnot. And so they basically make it that if your charter is or if you're a religious group that has chartered the organization, that basically you can choose to not allow queer people to lead in your scouting group because it goes against the values that you teach. And there are a lot of people, like, for example, the Human Rights Campaign president, Chad Griffin, basically said, like, well, it should just be that they're allowed no matter what. But then you get religious organizations that say this is even a little bit too far. And for example, and Kara, maybe you can touch on this a bit too, because it specifically notes the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints saying that the organization is reevaluating its relationships with the Scouts because they believe that the Scouts should not allow queer people whatsoever.
Which is bizarre because the Mormon Church also takes a stance that it's okay if you're gay as long as you don't act on it.
I guess I misspoke there. I apologize. So I'm going to correct myself. So a specific quote, it says, "The church has always welcomed all boys to its scouting units, regardless of sexual orientation," the statement reads in part. "However, the admission of openly gay leaders is inconsistent with the doctrines of the church and would have traditionally been the value of the Boy Scouts of America." And so that's a statement from, or part of the statement from, the Latter-day Saints.
So growing up, I actually initially thought that Boy Scouts were only Mormons. I didn't think you could be a Boy Scout if you weren't Mormon. But then I learned, I was like, okay. But then growing up, I only associated Boy Scouts, at least in my area, with religious organizations because all the Boy Scouts I knew had to adhere to these very strict organizations. I had no idea this was a national thing. So I'm very interested in how religions co-opted Boy Scouts and like these groups that were meant to be available for any boy or man that wanted to join. And then suddenly like these religious groups were pushing their philosophies on it. That was very bizarre to me when I realized that. I was like, wait, how did it get to that point?
It all comes down to money. Like so many things. The church gave a lot of money to the Boy Scouts of America, and they brought in a lot of people, and they didn't want to lose that. So, a lot of times when people are arguing principle, they're really arguing an awkward position they'll be in with somebody that gives them money.
Well, and ultimately too, a lot when, these youth groups started, you had a lot of religious groups working to get involved early on because it was a good way to keep their religious foundation within the country as, those children grew older.
Yep. It's like brand loyalty, essentially.
And then that actually is a pretty good segue to this, all this stuff about the church, because I definitely want to make sure we have enough time for it. We can maybe get back to this thing more about jobs and stuff, but like, let's talk about the church.
Let's talk about the church.
This could be an episode in and of itself.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
I want to, but like, I did want to mention it because I feel like we and a lot of things I've been listening to and reading, they kind of tiptoe around, this whole idea of like, is it right to be queer and religious? And there's a huge debate about it. We hear a lot about religious liberty to make sure that it doesn't mix. But at the same time, there's also a lot of people who are religious that have been really pushing for the church and queer people to become one. And actually, from a personal standpoint, one of the biggest surprises for me once I started like going into the gay world and being in dating guys and all that was that I expected all gay people to be anti-religion because so much of religion speaks against them. I just assumed that would be the case. And actually what I found is that like a huge number of, I mean, I'd say even a majority of gay people are religious or at least spiritual. A lot of them are, they go to church, they're open about it. Whether or not their church is really like that much for it. Some are, some are not. Like it's a big part of a lot of queer people's lives. And I did not know that going into it. I'm not religious myself, so I didn't have to worry about that aspect, but a lot of people do.
There was, when I was in college, there was someone I worked with, and he was one of the first gay people that I really got to know and really talk to, and he was very, very, very involved in the fight for equal rights for queer people, and two, his church. And he was so involved in the two, and so it's kind of the same as you, where it's like, you don't like, at least that's not the stereotype that you envision, but just because you're one thing doesn't mean you can't be the other.
I have a question for you guys.
Yeah.
What do you think that churches and religions have a right to say, this is what we believe, you can't change it, and if it doesn't fit what you believe, then you do not need to be a part of our congregation? Or do you think that they need to accept everyone? Like, what do you guys think about that?
No, I mean, ultimately it comes down to the Constitution. It comes down to freedom of religion. Obviously, if, you are preaching about, sacrificing babies and whatnot, like, we should probably change that. But ultimately, we talk about it. I think we're going to talk about a case here within the Methodist Church that they had these split views of, over LGBTQ people and, their acceptance within the church. And they decided to split the Methodist Church into basically it's traditional Methodist, and then, they call it like progressive Methodist or whatever. So ultimately, I don't think we can force them to change their religious views within the face of, freedom of religion. But I don't think we can stop somebody from, representing their own interpretation, just as the Methodist Church did, where they're like, okay, well, we're just going to split it up then.
Yeah, I mean, there should be no law that makes a religious organization do something within their own church that they don't want to do. I mean, that's the whole idea of religion is to have a safe space, so I understand that. I really do. I mean, if you're in the queer community, you understand the idea of having safe spaces more than anyone,
right.
So yeah, I mean, I think very few people are like, let's go in and change the church or whatever. Like they want them to change on their own. They want to encourage it. But as far as like a law or something, no, I would be completely like wrong. But again, like, when we talk about things like Hobby Lobby and stuff like that, just because, or even say Goodwill or something like that, which I think is actually run by a church rather than just a religious person. Like I don't think that necessarily like exempts you from running your non-religious business as as something that is prejudice. I think that should be changed. And by the way, Goodwill actually is fairly progressive, so I'm not saying anything bad about Goodwill. But I'm just saying, like, I think the church itself, I think your beliefs are your beliefs. I would hope to change your mind, but at the same time, I don't think the law should do it. But if your church happens to run a thrift store or something like that, yeah, the thrift store needs to treat people equally,
right.
even if the money does go to your religion, and that if you don't like it, that's just tough.
Good point. Great point, actually.
I think another example of, when I was talking about the Methodist Church splitting is, Carol, Carrie, you know this. that the Church of Latter-day Saints, so many people think, Latter-day Saints and Mormons are the same thing, which they are, but it's the same idea as the split Methodist, where if you look at the history of Mormonism, Latter-day Saints and Mormons are not exactly the same thing.
So it was the Latter-day Saints, and then it was the polygamists split off into the Federalists, Latter-day Saints. And the amount of times I got asked growing up how many moms I had, and I was like, "That's not me. That's the Federalists." Like, man. That's a great point. You can split.
Because in the face of freedom of religion, you can't take away their freedom of religion. It is what it is.
I do have to say too. Oh, sorry, Dalen.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say too, I just have a lot of empathy and compassion, and I guess like I admire individuals. Like if you are gay and you go to a church where you know that they don't necessarily support you, and you're still able to like have like your relationship with God or like pursue your spirituality through that. Like there's a lot of strength there, and I just have massive admiration for people who have to worship in an unsafe space, but do so because they believe so strongly in their faith. Like that to me is really incredible and like heartbreaking on so many levels. Mm-hmm. But I just have to say how much gosh, man, that's some strength.
Well, and nowadays though, there are enough churches out there that are accepting of the queer community that, I encourage, if you are a part of a church that is not accepting or even creepily trying to change you somehow, to seek out a church that better represents the kindness of your religion that you want to be a part of. Mm-hmm. Since you mentioned the Methodist Church, maybe we'll just say a couple of things about that real quick. This is a thing that's going on right now. It actually was stopped because of COVID, because it was inconvenient to have a meeting in St. Louis that was supposed to happen, I think, in February. But I was just talking to somebody today who was saying, isn't this whole gay thing over? Like, isn't this in the past? Hasn't it been figured out? And I said, like, you're really naive because, a lot of these things, they're in the middle of happening. Gay marriage has only been a thing for like 6-7 years, and literally this year, a major church, split, like you said, over this issue. If you happen to be driving by a Methodist church, you might have seen a pride flag up, which was supposed to be an indicator that they were going toward the gay friendly way. And one thing I found was interesting was the majority of Methodist churches in America actually went with the pro queer acceptance way. It was actually the problem was this is a worldwide organization, and even though most of the locations are in the U.S., locations that were in places like Africa were extremely against it, and so that's exactly why they voted to basically split off. It said the differences have simmered for years and came to a head in February 2019 at a conference in St. Louis where delegates voted 438 to 384. This is a worldwide vote for a proposal strengthening bans on LGBT inclusive practices. Most of the U.S.-based delegates opposed the plan and favored LGBTQ-friendly options, but they were outvoted by U.S. conservatives teamed with most of the delegates from places like Africa and Philippines. In the aftermath of that meeting, many moderate and liberal clergy made clear that they would not abide by the bans, and so they started coming up with this idea to split. They have kind of like partially split, and it's kind of a big mess right now. But essentially, what they did was they allowed them to keep their land and like the money that the land and the building actually brought them, but like they wouldn't keep supporting them, sort of thing. Like that's kind of how the split happened. So it was a really, like, even though it was a hot issue, like they actually figured out a way to do it that was generally pretty fair, I think, to both sides of that, where they could continue practicing the way they wanted to practice. And so, I mean, I think ultimately it's going to be a really good thing for the people who are part of these congregations that want to be more accepting of queer people.
And we talk about this, and I wonder what the basis of the people who do not want to include queer people within, the church, within the clergy, because, through the research that we found, it seems like within the Bible, within Scripture, it never really even mentions homosexuality. There's the term sodomy, which is biblical, and there's all this what they would consider deviant actions, but so much it is based off of the sexual act and not the fact that it's necessarily a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, and of course it's focusing more on man. But for example, they where they talk about gang rape, for example. Back in Roman and Greek times, gang rape was basically used as a means of humiliation. It was a means of, basically putting people below you down and humiliating them and making them, feel that they were lesser than you, less human. And so they were condemning the fact that, it was sodomy, it was gang rape, but it was interpreted through time, and no one really knows when these interpretations came to light. But the interpretation was that it wasn't necessarily the gang rape in itself. What was wrong was that it's men enacting sexual acts on other men.
Well, I mean, basically, it was the rape was wrong. It has nothing to do with consensual sex.
Exactly.
That's the big difference. I mean, nobody has ever, fought for rape. I mean, that's not a winning battle. That's a terrible thing. So it's and to make them the same thing is like a huge leap that you have to make. That doesn't really hold water. So, okay, let's go through a couple of these. So what does the Bible actually say about homosexuality? I did a lot of research on this, which is tough for me because I'm not religious, and I know almost nothing about the Bible. So a lot of this is coming from research I've done just recently. I'm not trying to act like I know more than I do, but I definitely wanted to talk about this part.
Which I will say too, I have not read the Bible. I don't go to church, so yeah.
I am happy to be your resident Bible checker as someone who
Thanks,
in depth for 18
Kara.
years, 3 days a week. That's you guys. Let's and roll it.
Appreciate it.
Let's see. So, quote, for Christians to whom the Bible is God's very written word, it is widely understood that God produced its content through the inspired human authors to tell the story of God's creation, how sin entered the world, and the redemption that is found through Jesus Christ and salvation. In this light, the Bible is often seen as the primary source that helps us figure out how the people of God should live. It is important to point out, though, that being God's word doesn't mean we come to understand what is right or wrong through reading isolated passages. Rather, most Christians make these difficult determinations by studying what the whole of the scripture says regarding a specific topic, exploring the linguistic, historical, and cultural context which the words were written. And so that's really important. I guess there's some people that believe everything literally happened, and they make these huge assumptions of what words meant then means is the same of what it means now. And in a lot of cases, that is definitely not. It could not have been the way that was.
Mm-hmm. Kara,
go ahead.
Growing up, because basically what Curtis had just read to is that look at the story, look at the Bible within a whole. Don't use just specific. Obviously you can pick specific scripture, if you're referencing or whatever, but don't use specific scripture to basically confirmation bias your thoughts. So. When you were growing up in a religious household, how were you taught how to handle, what the lessons that were taught to you through, your religion?
I feel like there's so much debate in the religious communities, and that's why we even have all these examples to discuss, because
Right.
I knew so many people that were like, it is verbatim, you follow the Bible. I knew so many people that believed it was parables. It was literally it didn't actually happen. And then I also knew people that were like, okay, times are extremely different now than they were back then. Like we can't necessarily apply what happened back when Jesus was around to today's modern world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's exactly the problem. I was lucky, I think, to grow up in a house where my mom taught me we love everyone. We respect everyone's decisions. But even within my church community, people were arguing about how to interpret the Bible. So how can we expect an entire nation, or God forbid the government, to argue this question correctly when one congregation, one religion argues how to interpret these things?
Mm-hmm.
That's why it scares me when we have these conversations on like a national platform or on a political platform, because we're making decisions about people's lives when the 300 people in my church service couldn't even decide how to interpret these things.
Right.
So,
and then that's when you get people who, challenge how, a specific church has been interpreting the Bible. That's when you get, the faction that's split off, and some people agree, some people don't. And I guess you hope that leads to some kind of progression, but who knows? Everyone's going to interpret everything differently.
There's always this push to. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, I think that's what bothers me so much, is that it is interpretation, right? These are very old texts, and we're interpreting things, and then we're telling people. And I understand, you can interpret it pretty well most of the time, I would say.
Yeah.
But it's interpretation. So if you're telling someone that what they're doing is sinful and evil and all these things, I hope you're right. I hope you interpreted that right, because you're telling someone that they're like evil in the eyes of God. And I think that's quite scary. But I also understand religion it's a tough subject. And I don't want to also criticize people who are, believers.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy that somebody who doesn't have to go through the questioning of their sexuality would be so opinionated by it. It's not on them if they're wrong. So if somebody is very passionate about something that is to do with their own soul, it seems like you would at least consider their risk and their wanting to find that place where they feel at peace to at least listen to their argument.
Yeah, but you have to remember, if it's the church and it's a doctrine, it's that the difference is heaven and hell. And in the Bible, it talks about how you are given more, a lot of religious belief, because this is in the Bible, that if you bring people to God, you're doing that's the work. That's what the work you're doing here. So you're saving someone from hell. And how do you reason with someone like that? Because it is good intentions. That is a good intention, but it can cause a lot of damage and trauma to someone.
Well, you look at Alfred Kinsey, who we talked about in, I believe it was the last episode, and he struggled a lot with his sexuality growing up and as a child, and he was part of, I believe, he was part of the Boy Scouts, and his father was a devout evangelical, and he would get these sexual urges and these impulses to masturbate, and their response, they would make him flog himself to get him to basically deteriorate his mind of those impulses and those temptations. And it scarred him for the rest of his life.
A lot of these things, they seem radical at the time just because it's tradition that you're used to. It's maybe you are a 50 or 60-year-old person, and when you grew up, you didn't know any gay people, and they weren't part of the church, and you assume that this is just a new thing or a fad or something like that.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of affirming Christians, which are the ones that are queer and religious at the same time, is that they're not overturning Christian tradition.
Exactly.
They're trying to set it right.
Exactly.
They're really trying to. They're not trying to change your traditions. They're trying to say, we want to be a part of this too.
Yes, we love the same God. Let us worship together. But yeah, I think it's hard because it'd be so nice to simplify this, and it's so hard when you talk about religion. But yes, Curtis, exactly. That's they want to. The whole point is to have a community and to worship God together. But you're telling them no, they can't. That's not how it works. A sin is equal in God's eyes. That's how the Bible says it. All sins are equal. So, don't be gay, but I can go cheat on Tammy Sue. What? You know what I mean?
Let's talk about a couple of things that get brought up a lot. So I'm going to skip. The notes are a little weird here, but I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to. Let's talk about Sodom and Gomorrah.
There we go.
So sodomy is the term that's still used for anal sex, basically, and it comes from the Bible. So every time you hear anybody say sodomy or Sodom or anything like that, it always means that there's a reference to the Bible. It's hard to remove it from that. So right there, you should know that separation of church and state should not be a part of the law.
It's so entrenched within the American judicial system and just legal system.
It really is, yeah. And so basically what happened was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is commonly assumed to have been the result of God's wrath against homosexuality. But the only form of same-sex behavior described in the story is an attempted gang rape, which is what you were alluding to before.
Yep.
It's not like the loving, committed relationships that are widespread today in the queer community. The Bible explicitly condemns Sodom for its arrogance and hospitality and apathy toward the poor, but never for same-sex behavior. Quote, same-sex rape was a common tactic of aggression and humiliation in the ancient world. Gang rape is completely different from loving relationships. But having Christians always understood the sin of Sodom to be same-sex behavior, and that answer to that is actually no. That was not the original interpretation of the Sodom story, which dates back to the 14th century BC. So even in the time since these stories were written, they've changed their interpretation over time. So it's not like year one, this was already an established thing that we've always known, and it's breaking tradition if we don't. This was actually something that was put upon the Bible by people who interpreted it that way hundreds of years. 1,000 years later, 1,400 years later. So the term sodomy was not actually coined until the 11th century. And even then, it was widely used to refer to all non-procreative sexual acts, including heterosexual acts, not just same-sex. So it was basically anything that didn't yield children.
Which is another thing we talked about. In I think the first episode of the series is that homosexuality was condemned because how can you be a responsible human being? How can you be a responsible part of society if you are not contributing to procreation, to the advancement of the human race?
Yeah, it was a longevity thing. It was a be fruitful and multiply thing. It wasn't really meaning that God hates gay people. There's a joke that I like that a priest says, we just found an ancient scripture that has been buried for thousands of years. And then there's like a big pause, and he says, it actually said God hates figs.
That's
all this time, all this stuff, and God hates figs. So don't eat figs.
I don't really like figs.
But it's a joke because of how easy it is to misinterpret something from that long ago. So you guys want to cover Leviticus? Let's switch to that. That's another major.
So Leviticus condemns male same-sex intercourse. Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13.
So Leviticus is something that's cited a lot by anti-gay people that it's a sin. But the entire Old Testament law code has never applied to Christians in the light of Christ's death. I'm getting a lot of this from the Reformation Project, which is a really great resource if you want to hear more about this from somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, versus me that just is reading about it. But yeah, basically the idea was Christ died for your sins, therefore you are resolved of those basic sins as long as you believe in Christ and follow that that church. And that's really important for a lot of Christians. It's like the bedrock of that. So this whole idea of Leviticus condemning same sex, even if it is true, would have been resolved by the death of Christ. Moreover, the prohibitions of male same-sex relations reflect culturally bound concerns about patriarchal gender roles, which the New Testament points us beyond. So talking about the New Testament undoing the Old Testament. And so a lot of people are citing the original source, but not the updated source.
So you have this quote here. So male same-sex intercourse was prohibited because it subverted patriarchal gender norms of male dominance in a society that devalued women. So even within that quote, it's not necessarily about it's not homophobia, it's sexism against women in
Right.
that explanation. It's not that they're partaking in homophobic acts, it's that it's taking away from the male dominance over women in the society.
Yeah, and I mean, and if you are somebody, of modern times that, that think women are equal, then you should be over this, because basically it was saying like how sort of like, terrible it would be if you were, if a man having sex with another man, the one that was receiving the sex would be, as low as a woman. Like, I mean, that's so sexist. It's so backwards. And yet this is something that people, I think that even, that are somewhat forward thinking as far as, gender equality, still use as a reason that gay people shouldn't exist.
It's stuff like this that makes me struggle with understanding people that take the Bible literally. I don't understand how that's possible.
Yeah, it said things like, slavery, that's cool. It said, it said all kinds of things that we don't follow today, and we don't even really think about. Like, it's so silly we ignore it. But then the things that we have these biases for, we point to it like it's the absolute end all of all laws. It's like, well, no, it kind of changes over time. Something that gets mentioned in another thing I'm going to bring up in a little bit is this idea of Alpha and Omega, and that that basically that the Bible was written, it's done. It is exactly how perfect as it is, or whatever. But Alpha and Omega actually means that God is God from the beginning to the end, and that everything in the middle can actually change. That God will be a part of that change. So the idea, if you believe that God is a part of everything, then you have to believe that God is a part of queer people, because that is part of the design, the change. That it's kind of like, it's weird to think that God's work started or ended with the beginning of the world. So it's just, I don't know, it's a bit naive.
Well, it's like I said, I think before we started recording, is if humans are God's creation, if we are God's children, then how are we to condemn somebody who is gay because even though they are, God's creation? And this is why I really wish we had someone on the show right now who shared some of these views to explain them, just because there's really no way of knowing if we don't have somebody who can explain them directly.
That's true.
But it's something that I've always questioned. And I guess, Kara, maybe you have some further insight on that idea.
I don't know. I think God's children are supposed to be imperfect. And again, the Bible says all sins are equal. So it does make you think that maybe the homophobia in churches is because of people. And it's tough to blame it on religion, because people can corrupt religion. But if you're following it the way it's supposed to be, you're supposed to love everyone. So that always gets lost on me too. I don't understand it.
Well, I think the exact example of corruption in religion is, pedophilia that was found within the Catholic Church.
Right. And it actually, like something I didn't realize when I first saw Spotlight, which is about that investigation that led to to basically unearthing it. Oh, really?
Yeah, that was he was a professor at my school.
Oh, wow.
They cracked it by they were comparing, sorry, Curtis, I totally cut you off because I got really excited.
It's cool.
They cracked the pedophilia case in the Catholic Church in Boston, which, by the way, the Catholic Church in Boston it's an identity for Boston people.
Right.
They were comparing books that showed where priests were moved and when there were scandals, and realized that, every time a priest gets accused of, being a pedophile, he gets moved to a different location. But anyway, sorry, I was such an aside.
Here,
I got excited.
Yeah.
Real quick, I'm going to put my wife, Shelby, on because she has actually a little bit of input on my question about, I guess, the acceptance and denial of homosexuals within the church. So here's Shelby.
Hi, Shelby.
Hi, Shelby. Hey, girl. My best friend.
Oh, hey. I hear that, you broke all of your tires today, so that sucks.
That's fine. We're here now, and that's all that matters, everyone. Go ahead, Shelby.
Okay, so to be clear, I do not believe this, but I grew up in a very religious community and was taught this in my youth group. And basically, being gay in the eyes of many people is inherently a sin. There's a couple different Bible quotes and verses that say what people can interpret as homosexuality as a sin. The most popular one, of course, is the one in Leviticus, which says a whole lot of things are sins that we do all the time. But just like any other sin, we're taught that Christ forgives those sins if you are repentant and you pray and you say you're sorry. And that is where there gets to be this kind of difficulty within, at least my experience in the church, is that you still have to say that that's a sin and you have to try to not do it. So if you are openly gay and living that lifestyle and, you know, have a boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it might be, you are not sorry and you're not trying to not do that. And so that's where the church, they find it difficult because you're not saying you're sorry and you're not actively trying to not do that. And so that's where you get a real sticky situation with a lot of people trying to understand homosexuality. And in my church, at least, that's what actually drove apart families, is that they could understand being gay to a point, but they couldn't understand embracing being gay. And that really, really upset them.
Right. There is this movie that I had referenced called Come Sunday. And in it, it's this in the 80s. And it's this big mega, preacher at this mega church. And he has it's his piano player is struggling because he's gay. And he tells him, and I said this before, is there's a difference between being gay and doing gay. And it sounds like that's exactly what it was taught within your church.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a form of progressivism, but it also is like damaging in and of itself. Like, it's like, come in here, we want you to be a part of us, but you are inherently bad until you apologize. That's a backhanded like, hug or whatever. Like, I don't know.
Oh, yeah. And it gets really, really complicated. Actually, within my own youth group, we had a boy who came out as being gay. And his family didn't accept him at all. He was completely suicidal. But we actually called like our preacher to go talk to him because they were just inherently very close. I don't know. I grew up with a lot of people loving our preachers and stuff. But our preacher actually had to go and like basically tell him, look, your family doesn't support it. A lot of the church doesn't support it. And that sucks. But ultimately, the person who matters the most, in this view at least, which is, God and Jesus and kind of the epitome of what you're doing, they love you regardless. And he did a really good job of helping that man. I guess now he's a man. He's always like 12 in my head, I guess. But he did a really good job of helping him like understand that his parents are never going to accept him, and that really sucks. But ultimately, it's like your heavenly Father that matters the most. And I wish that more priests and preachers would take that route of like, it doesn't really matter if it's a sin or not, because the ultimate, like your Savior, cares and wants to save you. And that's what's most important. But it's really, really hard for people to find that, and it's really hard to accept that. And I don't know if y'all know this, but the church in general has a really hard time with new things. We're really bad at that. So maybe in like 100 years, we'll be like kind of okay with it. But anyway, I'll pop out. Thanks for letting me come on.
Yeah, it was interesting. It's interesting, like that. It's like a half. It's kind of like a half measure. It's kind of like walking a line. It's actually what my very liberal friend Damien would say was like kind of like the worst part about being in the middle of the road is just that like you end up sort of giving credence to both sides, and so it's like I understand that it is progressive and it is better than saying kicking someone out or driving them to suicide, but at the same time it's like it's interesting because it's by sort of half accepting it, I feel like that person's only going to be half a person until they come to grips with it. And it's interesting that at least lately, a lot of people are really trying to bring back, particularly young, queer people to the church by trying to sort of change the discussion to not just be like we'll accept your sin to maybe this wasn't even a sin to begin with.
Right. Yeah. It's not we're accepting that you are sinning. It's we're accepting that this is who you are. We're accepting you as a person, not as a person who is just sinning.
Yeah, but queer people, they don't want to be associated with all of sins. I mean, it's
Right.
just weird. Like, it's like, you say you're coming up for forgiveness and the person ahead of you murdered somebody, and it's like in their eyes, you're just as bad as them, So, I mean, it's sort of like from a gay perspective, like it would just be like, I don't know. I would have a difficult time with that. I would be like,
Right.
like this is on a no level close to all these other actual bad things that people are doing, and yet you're treating it as if you're forgiving me just the same way. I don't know. I don't like that.
And perhaps if you grew up, like, I guess growing up, were you at all involved with religion?
Me a little bit with Catholic, but not really. I was baptized and I kind of stopped after. I pretty much lost interest when I was a kid.
Yeah. And so, and maybe if you hadn't, of course, you'd be probably sitting in a completely different seat than you are now with a different perspective on it.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, and a lot of people are very okay with being both religious and queer. And that's really cool that they're able to do that. And I hope it's because the churches are slowly but surely coming to grips with it, but like Shelby said, it's a very slow process, and it's a process that will outlive you. So it's like, it's not something that that you can be like, well, maybe next year. It's like, well, maybe 2 or 3 generations from now. And I don't know. I don't have that kind of patience.
I don't think many people do. I guess maybe we have to, though. But Curtis, can you, I know you got into this right before we started recording, but could you tell us a little bit about the Reformation Project?
Yeah, Reformation Project is a really cool resource. Here, let me skip down a little bit. One second. There we go. So basically, they're an organization that look to connect the churches and trans citizens and queer in general, but there's a real big push right now for trans rights. To try to teach that they're not a mistake of God, but that the mistake is of a modern society that basically misnamed them. In case of the trans movement, that you're assigned female or male at birth, and by you saying that no, I'm not a man, I'm a woman, or I'm a woman and not a man. By you saying that, you're not like trying to say that God was wrong. You're trying to say that whatever society named you that to begin with, just because of what genitalia you had, was not accurate. And so there's an absolutely fantastic YouTube video that everybody should watch from the Reformation Project. About 45 minutes, and it's a trans person talking about their struggle and sort of how they came up on top of understanding their religion and realizing that it was okay to be themselves. They talk about how the church usually has 3 schools of thought on being queer. One is that it's an intentional, correctable sin done to spite or to walk away from God. That's not how they felt, personally. So that wasn't right for them. 2, that the queer people are sick and need to be fixed, which I guess is probably closer to what we were talking about before with we accept your sin, but it'd be better if you stopped being this way. So that doesn't really work for a lot of queer people. I think it's a very unhealthy way of being within your church.
Oh, yeah.
And then the third one is a expression of natural diversity. And that one is a much more positive part, or way to feel about yourself. It's this idea that in the scripture, there's lots of cases of people that were they dressed a little differently. Sometimes, there's kind of a hint that they were, that they dressed in a different clothing than what their gender norm would have allowed them to, things like that. There's different hints about people being different. And so they talk a lot about that. One of my favorite things was that in the case of trans people specifically, they talk about these binaries of God, that God created a man and a woman only, one or the other, pick one, or they would say you're picked at birth and that's what you are. And the thing that they point out was God also created the land and the sea, but how do you explain estuaries or rivers or all these things that are related or a part of it, are between them, but aren't necessarily, just those two things. So the idea is, just because the Bible says there are two things does not mean that there are not more things between it, or different interpretations of those two binary things. So it really creates this idea of where trans people can feel as if they're a part of God's plan and not somehow like a separate thing from it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you kind of think about that too, right? Like, it's man and woman to make child. And if, everything is God's creation, wouldn't you think that would be consistent throughout nature? But, you look at, there are so many instances within nature where there are certain, animals, or, insects, mammals, whatever they may be, amphibians and whatnot, that where they have different ways of, procreating. They, you have different roles within some, sea creatures where the female is much more dominant than the male. And so if there's not that consistency within the natural world, within, animals and insects and creatures, why does there have to be that consistency within human beings if we're all part of God's creation?
Well, and even if there weren't that in the animal kingdom or whatever, like we are human beings, we have the minds to be who we are and to change and to do things at a higher level, so just because we're not acting like, I don't know, some random animal or something would act or whatever, doesn't not necessarily mean it's wrong. We're not eating, raw meat on the ground or whatever, it's like we have evolved. And if we have that ability, why is it necessarily wrong?
Right.
One thing that was mentioned is Romans. It addresses that is also mentioned as a way to sort of like put gay people on the defensive, but that Romans actually addresses unrestrained lust, not sexual orientation. And in the ancient world, it assumed that all people should be satisfied with heterosexual sex, but that some people, even back then, went beyond that because they had this, quote, insatiable lust that led them to engage in same-sex behavior. Probably what it really was is it was attraction, but they thought of it as in addition to what was necessary to procreate, and therefore it was lust. It was over the top and should be condemned. And so, like, a lot of people think of as Romans as a warning against homosexual sex, but it actually is more about unrestrained lust. So there's lots of that case where, I don't know, I mean, in the animal kingdom, there's lots of unrestrained lust, but it doesn't necessarily need restraining, I guess.
I know
in the modern world.
I know there's a passage in the Bible, and I'm sure Shelby knows this because she was talking about it the other day, but it's, they're talking about basically if it literally says, like, if you cannot keep your eyes off of a woman, if you're so lustful that, you have to, go at this woman, then maybe you should gouge your eyes out, and that's the stance that the Bible takes, and people seem to ignore that.
I mean, what's crazy is if you can't stand looking at two guys kissing.
That was Matthew 5:29. It was the King James version of the Bible.
I was going to say, if you can't stand it looking at two guys kissing, maybe you should stab your own eyes out. I mean, like, who are you to, tell somebody else
right.
that their eyes, are the problem? And it's like, it's just, I don't know. It's very, very presumptuous.
Well, it's, it's instilled within, even our school systems, the whole idea that, I think we all experience this probably growing up in elementary school is, a girl can't show her shoulders because it's distracting for the boys. And it's like, well,
guys,
maybe the boys should.
To make sure, no, this is my responsibility as a woman. I was told when I was 12 to help the boys because y'all can't control your urges. So I want to help y'all out.
Unrestrained lust that we have.
But
Exactly.
it all goes back to the interpretation of the Bible and how, like, the real issue was the lust, and it's like, well, maybe you should just control yourselves, but it's interpreted differently, and it's instilled in our societies in ways like this where people don't even realize it.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, there's been a lot of updating to the church. I think actually out of necessity. I mean, every time the church changes, it's not necessarily because they've become super enlightened. A lot of times, it's because it's unpopular to hold the belief that they have, and they're losing patrons. Not to make it just like a monetary thing. I'm not trying to be that necessarily negative about it.
A poll about that, and it was in a Washington Post article that talked about how millennials are not attending church anymore. So the Pew Research Center did a poll. They tracked America's religious landscape, and they found that amongst 23 to 38-year-olds in 2019, roughly 2/3 attended worship services just a few times a year or less, and 4 in 10 said they seldom or never go. A decade ago, more than half of the people went to church. So, literally, and Curtis, this is what you're talking about, I think, our generation is not attending church very often. And a lot of that has to do with what these studies find is because, well, why should I? It doesn't like me. They don't want me there. They don't like my lifestyle. So churches are absolutely changing the way they are. And I don't think there's anything necessarily bad with that. There's some public pressure of saying, okay, you can keep believing that, but just so you know, like, you're going to have a very small congregation because you're kicking so many people out. So I'm kind of glad that public pressure is there.
And Pope Francis actually said something about that. I don't have the quote written down here, but it was something like in order to kind of maintain the attention and the sort of the relevancy to a newer generation, that like they should look into being more accepting, and which is forward thinking, but it's also just smart, just smart business, just smart. If you want to have the largest religion, you want to have them, the most people, and the most people you're affecting positively, hopefully, you have to go with the times. You have to, let the women wear pants. You have to, you have to desegregate. You have to do all these things, and every it seems like a fight up until it happens, and then we forget it ever was anything different. And now this is the new thing. It's acceptance of gay and trans people.
If you remember, I don't know if you do remember, this was a really big thing. I can't remember when it was. It was a while ago. I believe I was still in the church. The Mormon church made a rule that if you had gay parents, you could not be baptized into the church. That was a huge deal because you were basically suffering, quote unquote, from your parents' decisions. And it was the biggest withdrawal from the church that the church had ever seen. People were going in droves to turn in their letters, basically is what you have to do. Attorneys were coming out of the woodwork, helping people file to get off church records. And a couple of years later, the church said, oh, actually, you can actually get baptized, whatever. So it's good. These things are good. Like these movements of saying like, well, fine then. If you're not going to accept me, I'm not coming are good. If you have like the ability and the strength and the time to do that,
I mean, we have a note here about Pope Francis, which is fairly new, about sort of kind of back and forth about how sometimes he's been very positive about accepting of gay people. Other times, at least privately, not been quite so much, saying, I guess privately he was supposed to have said that not to let people who are studying for the priesthood who were known to be gay, not to let them in. So there's definitely it's kind of a back and forth thing. But of all the popes that have ever been part of the church, definitely the most forward thinking, and a lot of conservative people have been either, I'm not sure if they've left the church, but they definitely have been very critical of that. I've heard family members talk about, this Pope is out of control, and he says all these things that and they're not happy with the direction.
It's very interesting too, because you look at, it's the status of, the Pope, who's supposed to be, is the head of the Catholic Church, and I feel like there's this idea that you're supposed to follow what the Pope says, but that idea of how there are people who don't agree with that and have changed their views, or left the Catholic Church or, fractured off like the Methodist Church did because of that, it kind of goes to show how political the church is even in itself. There's, religion within politics, but there's also politics within religion. And it goes a long ways.
Every time the Pope speaks against something Trump does, it creates a little bit of a divide because a lot of Trump supporters are very religious. And when the Pope says, this guy doesn't really, represent the most positive view of immigrants and the needy and the poor and all that stuff, when he says those things, there's always a little bit of a backlash against the Pope from people who would rather follow Trump than their religion. Yeah, so when gay marriage passed, it was supposed to be the end of the world for some people, quite literally. And we're a few years into it, and it didn't come to pass.
2020 is the end of the world if we're all thinking.
I don't think that was. I don't think 2020 was caused by gay marriage.
No, I'm pretty sure not.
But the views have changed quite a bit for Americans really rapidly, more rapid than any other social issue over the last few decades, and that has changed politics. It's changed the Democratic Party to some degree. It's even changed the Republican Party with Trump and one of the Supreme Court justices they put into office saying that gay marriage was settled, it was over, move on, which was a rare good part of that presidency. And a lot of that is because of perception. So today, 79% of Americans who are religiously unaffiliated favor same-sex marriage, as do 66% of white mainline Protestants and 61% of Catholics. That's a big deal in the Catholic community, by the way. 61% might as well be, I think that's about the best you're going to get for a while. Because Catholics are very, very traditional in a lot of ways, and they usually happen to be very, very Latino or Latina, and so which is one of the races that so often are against say gay people or are definitely gay marriage. Still, this is roughly double the level that it was in 2009. Among white evangelical Protestants, however, only 29% favor same-sex marriage, but that is actually double what it was in 2009 when only 15% were for that. So basically the point is it is huge. It is really gained a lot of traction in the last few decades. And it also depends on your age. If you're from the silent generation, which are people born between 1928 and 1945, you have a 45% chance of agreeing with gay marriage compared to 74% of millennials, which are born between 81 and 96. Republicans and Republican-leaning people are much less likely to favor gay marriage. 44% versus Democrats, which are 75%. So, I mean, it's you're right. It's very political, and it's one of those things. It should not at all be political. Like, it should have nothing to do with the fact that you are a conservative that likes your taxes cut as to what you think people should do in the bedroom. It should not be connected.
And we talked earlier, even in the Supreme Court case where Merrill basically said that marriage is not about love. Marriage is about legality, and we see it says here 84% of LGBT adults and 88% of the general public cited love as a very important reason for getting married. Then it goes on to say that LGBTQ Americans are twice as likely to cite legal rights and benefits as more important reasons for getting married. It's 46% versus 23%, and then the general public are also twice as likely as LGBTQ Americans to cite having children as the reason for getting married, 49% versus 28%. So even the reasons for marriage have the ideas for the reason for marriage have changed after gay marriage has been allowed within the United States.
Yeah, I mean, if you're straight, you've always had the ability to have kids. You've always had the protections in the law, so you don't value them like people that have never had it. The other thing I thought was interesting was in the U.S. Or the U.S. is among 29 countries and jurisdictions that currently allow gay and lesbian couples to wed. And there's a lot of countries that don't still, even today, even in 2020. So the world is not
29 of like 216 countries.
It's more than that, I think. I mean, there's lots of little countries.
That's fair.
But yeah, and Netherlands, just for trivia's sake, Netherlands was actually the first to legalize gay marriage in the year 2000, which is appropriate. New century, new understanding of gay marriage, and in May 2019, Taiwan became the first country in Asia to allow gays and lesbians to legally wed. So that means all the other countries in Asia don't allow it.
I was very interested actually to see South Africa on there. I didn't expect that, honestly, and I guess I don't know why.
It's a racial thing. I mean, South Africa is the only part of Africa that has a large white, I think maybe even larger white population over black population. So I think it's something somewhat to do with the different races understanding it differently, or being, let's say, less anti-gay than the average African person. And it also has to do probably somewhat with white privilege.
Curtis, we're getting there on time, so why don't you take us out on a very important note here?
Yeah, so this is the end of a really long 3-part series, and congratulations for everyone that stuck in and did the whole series, because it was really important. Coming up, we're going to be doing some more on trans history and the whole trans experience, which I'll let you talk more about in a second. But so don't turn the dial yet or whatever. Keep listening. But a good note to kind of wrap this up on just a really positive thing is all of these people and organizations that have been fighting for this since the beginning of America, and then even before the U.S. and the rest of the world. It's really come to a place where we can finally sort of start experiencing equality, but we're not quite there yet. There's a lot of progress still to happen, but we have come a long way. And in the United States, back in 1980, the Democratic Party was the first to actually support the gay activist movement, and they actually added it to their official roster of things that they wanted to do. So
platform.
The Democrats were, their platform. Thank you. Democrats were way ahead of that. Republicans have come a long way and are definitely a lot more supportive than they used to be. Unfortunately, Trump removed a lot of LGBT information from the White House website. So that is definitely a negative in that administration. So, erasure is a real thing. And as people think that it's all over, it actually can make you go backwards. So to end it all out, I kind of got off on a tangent there. Sorry.
No
worries. But if you're out there, if you're in the process of coming out, or somebody that is dealing with that, it's a really scary thing to go through, and it's very isolating. There's a lot of self-doubt and questioning and stuff that you have to do. It's not at all easy. So these were some tips that we found looking online, and then just from experience to help you try to get through that. You got to remember that this process, it takes months, years, or even decades, and whatever is right for you is what's right. So there's no, you don't have this much time and then it's over, or if you're over this age, you can't do it. I've met people who were in their 50s and 60s that still weren't out. And although I don't think that that's right, I think you should come out, and I think you should be yourself. I understood that. And, and I still to this day haven't said anything about it. So if you're going through this, make sure you have your support network in place. Mm-hmm. Don't judge people's initial reactions, because like when I was coming out, everybody, pretty much everyone in my life was more than okay with it, almost annoyingly okay with it, because I wanted them to be, I wanted them to ask some crazy questions, and I was all ready, and I thought about it all this way, and the most common answer was, "We still love you," which is a great thing to say, but it's also like, like it's also just kind of anticlimactic if you're ready to have a whole discussion about it,
I remember when you first told me, it was you, Connor, and I were at lunch in, I think it was Great Falls, to shoot a tournament. And Connor's my best friend, and he's gay, and you hadn't mentioned it to me before. That was my third year working with you, and
oh really? Wow.
We were just like in conversation, and you mentioned your boyfriend at the time, and you turned to me and said, I date men too. And I was just like, okay. I was like, cool. Like, great.
So I was past the time where I was like, Dalen, we have to talk.
Yeah, you were just like, it was like kind of like, oh, by the way. And then I was like, all right, like, great.
Yeah, that's a great story. It's funny. Yeah, so don't judge people's reactions, because sometimes, when you surprise somebody with something, especially if they assume that you are a different way, they might not say the best thing. They might not say anything. When I told my dad, he basically didn't say anything for about a week.
Oh, yeah.
And like that was the hardest person.
Everybody's gonna react differently.
Yeah, and then some people, they come back later and they say, oh well, let's talk about this more. But most people, they're not ready to say anything right away when you surprise them. So treat them carefully. They haven't thought about it as much as you have. Only tell who you want. That's a really important thing. The order of who you tell is not necessarily your family first or your church first. First person you tell should be somebody that is going to be okay with it, because you don't need somebody to tell you you're wrong when you're right. So tell somebody that you're comfortable with, somebody that you trust, and it's not going to blow it out of proportion or make some big deal out of it. And do it in whatever order you're okay with. If you get a bad reaction, which I definitely have, and which I think most people have, at least somewhere in their life, it's gonna hurt. It's gonna sting. It's gonna be really hard. This article said, it might feel like your heart's been ripped out. And in some cases, it's scary, because if you're young and you're living with your parents or something, there's a real risk of or a real question about are they going to react so negatively that I'm going to get kicked out of the house? And there's a lot of organizations now, thankfully, that if you are kicked out of your house, you can call them, you can go on their website, and they actually will help you. Because it really was common in the past. It's somewhat common now. I've definitely met people where that happened to. And when you're deciding who to tell, you have to take that into account. If you're dependent on someone, you might not want to tell them, and it might hurt, and you might need to work on, you might need to work on your personal situation to get out of that situation before you tell them. And so then that gives you a goal, this much time I'll have enough to move out and live on my own. And then I'm going to tell them. And then, I don't know, in my experience, at a certain point, you're just, F it. I need to tell everyone, like, accept it, don't accept it. Like the worry outweighs the benefit. So at some point, I think everyone reaches that. With me, it was thankfully pretty quickly. It took me about 6 months to tell most people, although I think I told you later. but yeah, for most people, it was about 6 months. And so that was my time. But there's no, if you need to take a couple years to tell, say, your parents that you're living with and you're 17 or something, do that, because you want to make sure that you're in a safe place and you have something to fall back on. So that's it. Be yourself. Come out.
There we go.
That was great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, Curtis, I know this one was very important to you, and it was, obviously personal for you. And I want everyone to know who's listening that and if you look on the website underneath each episode, I have the PDF of the show notes for every single episode, and the amount of work that Curtis has put in to these shows, and the amount of time and the amount of research that Curtis put into this series, just very, very well done. And I hope the people who listen, whether they listened out of curiosity, whether they listened to, help, confirm their thoughts, or, someone who listened to a different perspective, that they came away from this with the goal that or with the accomplishment that we try to put forth with the show of learning something new. But Curtis, just very, very well done. And I think all of our listeners will think the same way.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
But with that, that's it for Queer is History Part 3. That was a long series, but I think we did a great job. Keep listening. Coming forward, we're going to be doing another 3-part series focusing more on the trans community within the queer community.
Now it's a 4-part.
Yeah. So the first part of the series, we're going to be looking more into the history of trans people, specifically within America. And then we've got 3 interviews actually coming up. So episodes, oh goodness, what will those be? 11 and 12, we talk to 2 trans people. We go over a lot of the social aspects. We talk a lot about actually the healthcare system and issues that trans people face within health. And we go over the great debate of J.K. Rowling. So if you've been keeping up on that and you have your own opinions, listen in and we'll see what someone who's actually trans has to say about it. And then we will also be going further into actual gender expression and talking more about the drag community. With that, though, Curtis, Kara, do y'all have anything you want to plug for part 3 of Queer's History?
I just basically wanted to say thank you to you two. This definitely is, as you know, it's important to me as a queer person, but to you, it was great that it was important to you two as well. And because so much of this is so often kind of just done as the quick spark notes and kind of all pushed into 1 hour or whatever. And I really appreciate that, we were able to work on this over a period of, it's going to be into 7 episodes altogether between the 2 different things, because, a lot of the people that I've talked to over the years really feel marginalized, especially trans people. They feel like they've been left behind. And so it's just really cool that, even though they're related, we didn't kind of just shove everyone into the same episode and kind of called it a day. I really appreciate that the time and the energy that you guys are spending, to learn about this along with me and get that information out there. It's really important.
I agree. It's very, very important. So I hope we did well, and I hope we did well by the people who are listening. And I hope, I'm looking forward to the next episodes that we're recording. And the only thing I have left to plug is please, 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 please make sure you are registered to vote. Voting is coming up soon. Mm-hmm. Some states will be closing the ability to register to vote. If you are out of state, request an out-of-state ballot. You can still do that. It's important. We are very lucky to have the ability to vote. Not everyone does. So go ahead and vote.
Don't wait until November. Do not wait until November. You should be thinking about this way beforehand and making sure that you are registered, that you go on the web. There's plenty of websites you can check your status, your registration status, whether or not you're on absentee or if it'll be sent to you. There's always an office you can call. Really be proactive about that, because there's so many people that get turned away that want to vote because they thought of it the morning of and discover that their state, South Carolina example, doesn't allow them to vote, to register on the same day. They should have registered 30 days before, and all this stuff. So learn your rules, look up the YouTube videos, every state, the rules to vote, which is a great resource, and really just follow up on that.
And if you don't know if you're registered to vote, it's super simple to figure out. Literally just Google, am I registered to vote? And it's the first website, and you just enter in a little bit of info and it'll tell you whether you are or you aren't. And if you aren't, it will give you the information to register to vote. And if you want to tell us how we did on this series, go ahead and do that by leaving us a review. Whether it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher, leave us a review. Let us know how we did. This is a big 3-part series, and we're very proud of it. So let us know what you think. And go ahead and just give us 5 stars. Leave us a review saying whatever you want, but just give us 5 stars. And that's all we ask for. But with that, like I said, we're going to be going into another 3-part series on trans people in America. So stick around for that, and we'll talk to y'all later. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Social Discord, part of the Podcast Without Borders Network. You can get a hold of us by sending us an email at pwbnetwork@gmail.com. You can also check out our website at podcastwithoutborders.com. Thanks for listening.